Let's move on to our next panel. And our next panel is Managing the Consequences of Contamination, a Call to Action. And our chair is Kent Chandler and moderator for the panel. He serves on the Kentucky Public Service Commission. He's one of our newest commissioners, so welcome aboard. He's also served as executive director of the Public Service Commission. I think that's a great background when you have something and you can rise up to that. So he's also represented consumer advocates. So he's kind of seen the angles in many different ways. He has a Juris Doctorate from Northern Kentucky University. And I will turn it over to you, Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning. I guess it's still morning. I kind of lost time. That was a great last panel. So very excited for this panel today. It will be a success if we all walk away learning a little bit and that we all hear very little from me. So looking forward to hearing a lot from these four great panelists. First, we're going to do a quick introduction of each of the panels. I'm going to let them introduce themselves, and then we'll move into a Q&A and then open up at the end with me, and then opening up at the end for questions from the audience. So first, we'll do a short introduction here with Dr. Weinrich.
Good morning, all. Thank you so much. My name is Dr. Lauren Weinrich. I am a principal scientist with American Water based in Camden, New Jersey. I've been with the company 17 years in the research department there, focusing on all things regulated and unregulated related to drinking water contamination. Since we're on a university campus, I got my PhD from Drexel University from Pennsylvania, but that was not before I got a master's from University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. So go Heels, and thank you.
And next is Jay Kooper.
My name is Jay Kooper. I'm the Vice President, General Counsel, and Secretary of Middlesex Water Company. Middlesex is one of approximately 9 investor-owned water utilities across the country. Our parent company serves approximately 61,000 retail customers in central New Jersey, one of the most densely populated regions of our country. I've been in the utility industry across every sector, water, gas, electric, telecom, cable, for 24 years, which is depressing me right now. And especially because there's some folks in this room who saw me year one. And while we're on college campus, I got my bachelor's at Emory University and my Juris Doctor at George Washington University. I cannot chant a nickname right now because I think GW is changing the nickname, the sports nicknames right now, so don't know who they are.
Great. And then Mr. Genzer.
Thank you. I'm Steve Genzer. I'm a partner at the law firm of Saul, Ewing. I also manage the firm's Newark office. Newark, New Jersey, not Newark, Delaware. Just had to say that. I've been a regulatory and rate lawyer for more than 45 years. So you think 24 years is depressing?
Yes.
Wait. Since we're doing colleges, I went to Lafayette College, which is a college in Pennsylvania, and to NYU Law School a very long time ago. I've also taught for 80 classes, 40 years at the NARUC utility rate schools, both in Florida and in California for forever.
And then finally, the person that has on this panel certainly taught me more than any of the others, Karen Stachowski.
Yes, my name is Karen Stachowski. I'm a Senior Assistant Attorney General in the Consumer Advocate Division of the Tennessee Attorney General's Office. I started with the Consumer Advocate in 2016. But before that, I had 17 of the 18 years before that with the State Environmental Agency. And one of those years that I was not at the State Environmental Agency, I was actually in the Attorney General's office with Law Enforcement and Special Prosecution Division, who were interested in doing environmental crimes. And I guess if I'm going to say my undergraduate is in biology, and I went to the Mississippi University for Women in Columbus, Mississippi. And I grew up in Memphis, so I went to the law school at the University of Memphis.
So the only thing that wasn't said about me in my introduction, it's fine. I went to Northern Kentucky University Law School. I'm not really I don't really care. Their sports teams are very underwhelming. But I did my undergraduate at Murray State University, and that I'm very proud of. Not that I attended there necessarily, but of their halfway good basketball team, given their size. So go Racers! We've got a mascot, and we're sticking with it. Go Racers! So first, before we get into some of the bigger policy issues, just to have an appreciation for what we're talking about today, I'm going to start with Dr. Weinrich and just ask if you can give us a little bit of background on, we're just going to call it PFAS, and a fairly high level, or as detailed as you'd like to get, why PFAS is concerning, and why its inclusion or presence in drinking water is such a concern for those of us that regulate it.
Yeah, that's a great way to start. Thank you. So for those backgrounds, analytical chemistry, so you're not going to get a chemist up on this panel without saying the full name of what PFAS stands for, but I'll hold off on that. So PFAS encompass a group of over 12,000 chemicals. So has anyone ever used a nonstick pan? Gone skiing and not had snow or rain stick to you? Waxed your skis? There are many uses for these compounds. As a chemist, they have amazing properties that resist water, resist stain, resist spills, and they're used in so many things in our modern day life. It's really pretty interesting when you start to consider how widespread they are. So back in the 80s, there were two of these group of 12,000 chemicals that were phased out that probably may be familiar to you, PFOA and PFOS. So they're all acronyms. I'm not going to do the full thing, but all of the F's stand for fluorine. And so these carbon-fluorine bonds are extremely good at what they do. They don't want to break down. That's why you hear them referred to as forever chemicals, because they are very resistant to degradation. They do their job really well because they can resist stains in water, et cetera. They're also used in firefighting foam. So in military bases, in airports, they have been used for putting out fires from fuel. They're very good at limiting the air that gets to those fires that creates, additional fires. So the firefighting usage of this group of chemicals has been increasingly challenging from an environmental perspective. So you apply the foam to the fire, it runs off from the airport or location in which the testing is done, gets into the environment, gets into the ground and groundwater, and stays there. So they took PFOA and PFOS out of production back in the 80s. However, that does not mean that they have been removed from the environment. As I said, they're very resistant to breakdown. So there's no natural biodegradation at this point for those two and for those two chemicals. And there's been a lot of research on their health effects, their persistence in the environment. And ultimately, being in the water industry, we are able to test and develop analytical tools to look at these compounds down to the parts per trillion level. So that's one drop in the Rose Bowl, if you consider perspective in what those units mean. Just recently, so the EPA has committed to taking action on PFAS. And number one, understanding their public health impacts, also understanding their occurrence in the environment, in water and other areas, and then committing to action on limiting their production, but also limiting their movement into the environment. So just last fall, the EPA came out with their strategic action plan. Everyone in the water industry has been very closely following what they're doing. Part of that action plan is essentially threefold. One is to propose regulations on PFOA and PFOS this coming fall. We believe in November or so. The other part of it is limiting these chemicals from getting into the environment through permitting from wastewater. So when we think about the environment and the cyclical nature of it, not only are humans part of this, right, what we're using, what we're flushing down the drain, what we're putting into the environment, And so the EPA also wants to look at that and see how we can limit these chemicals from continuing to move through the environment through permitting. And then the last part is just recently in August, the EPA came out with a proposed designation under CERCLA. So essentially, will these compounds be considered on Superfund sites? And that, at this point, may impact water utilities because we are not exempt from that designation. So public comment period started September 6th with that proposed regulation going into the Federal Register. So there are these three things that we are watching very closely, not only in the water industry, but in various other aspects. So there's more than a few things going on, and it is an extremely rapidly changing environment in terms of what we're learning about these chemicals. You know, like I said, there were two, PFOA and PFOS, that were phased out. They have now been replaced by other chemicals that are deemed to be less impactful to human health. However, we're still learning where they are in the environment, how they move through the environment, how they move through water systems, and what the impact on human health is. So there's a lot more to learn, a lot more to study. And you know, as a researcher, that is extremely important to see not only how we can protect public health, but also develop technologies to destroy these chemicals, to break them down efficiently, so we're not just moving it from one part of the treatment process to, you know, another, but rather limit this. And I think that is something that it's not just for water utilities, it's really for all of us that are using these products in our modern lifestyle, to understand where they're coming from, how we can make smart decisions to, you know, ask for better, safer alternatives, and continue the education and understanding of how we can make an impact.
So Jay, what is your experience and I guess Middlesex experience with PFAS?
So Middlesex Water's story with PFAS actually starts in what was an era of pre-regulation of these compounds. The US EPA first came out with a lifetime health advisory, not regulation, but health advisory in 2016 of 70 parts per trillion, so about 70 drops in the Rose Bowl, basically. Middlesex had actually been testing for PFOA under an EPA unregulated contaminant program, a voluntary program, since 2008. And we actually detected PFOA, the presence of PFOA, in one of our water treatment facilities called the Park Avenue Treatment Facility in South Plainfield, New Jersey, within our service territory. The PFOA that was detected was well below the 70 part per trillion health advisory. About a year after the EPA came in with an advisory, New Jersey's Department of Environmental Protection, our environmental regulator, came in with their own guideline level. Again, not a regulation, but a guideline at 40 parts per trillion. That was a maximum contaminant level advisory. And at the time, our levels were far below both the 70 parts per trillion and the 40 parts per trillion. So by the time we get to 2018, here's what Middlesex knew. We knew PFOA was present in our Park Avenue facility. We knew it was well below 70 parts per trillion and 40 parts per trillion, the federal and the New Jersey guidelines. We had heard rumblings that New Jersey's DEP was thinking of proposing a new rule with a more aggressive maximum contaminant level far below 40 parts per trillion, but we didn't know what that was. We knew we didn't put the PFOA in our own water system. It's a concept that has eluded some folks later on, as I'll discuss. But we knew at some point we would have to remove it, and better to remove it sooner rather than later before guideline became regulation. But one other important development in 2018, we learned the identity of the polluter. And certainly my co-panelist here can get into the chemistry far better than the lawyer here, but the chemical compounds of PFOA all contain a unique chemical fingerprint, a unique molecular fingerprint specific to the manufacturer of the PFOA. And in our case, it was the 3M company. They had been present in our area in New Jersey for much of the 20th century. We didn't know how specifically the PFOA gotten to the Park Avenue facility, but we knew it was 3M's PFOA that was there. So we did a couple of things in late 2018. We started planning for the remediation of our Park Avenue facility, which takes a lot of lead time for planning, for developing, and for ordering the remediation facilities that would go in to basically remove, and not even remove, but in our case, mitigate the PFOA to a standard we didn't know what it would be yet. And number two, we filed a lawsuit against 3M in the United States District Court of New Jersey in late 2018. With respect to the lawsuit, there was an attempt for about the next year or two by 3M to move our lawsuit into what's called the multi-district litigation panel in South Carolina, where a lot of identical cases get banded together, and we're talking about, if you're lucky, 5 to 10 years before your specific lawsuit within the multi-district litigation goes forward. We knew our PFOA was not connected to firefighting foam, which is the common thread at the multi-district litigation panel. So we were able to successfully stay one-on-one against 3M at the U.S. District Court in New Jersey. Discovery is over, and all we're doing now is awaiting the scheduling of a trial date to proceed forward. So that case is going forward, and hopefully going forward within the next few months. Meanwhile, though, New Jersey came in 2020, New Jersey's DEP, and they did set a more aggressive standard, this time by regulation. They said, effective January 1st, 2021, the PFOA maximum contaminant level will be 14 parts per trillion. And water systems will trigger this violation or exceed this standard if, on a rolling average, over 4 quarters, that rolling average becomes above 14 parts per trillion. No lead time, no long runway. So we were halfway through our remediation, and in October of 2021, we finally hit that rolling average threshold that finally sent Middlesex's Park Avenue facility above that 14 parts per trillion. So we basically had to sit with New Jersey's Department of Environmental Protection, and we received a formal notice of exceedance from the DEP, and we had to do a couple of things. They knew we were partway through our remediation program, and they basically ordered us, as I would have expected, to file a public notice. The language of the public notice had to adhere to very strict DEP language. If I had to sit down and write to the customers what was going on, I probably would have written something far different, something far more detailed, but a decision was made, and we sent out notifications. From those notifications, customers made decisions basically, oh my God, I gotta go out and get a filter, or oh my God, I gotta go out and get bottled water, or I gotta go see my doctor. Even though, really what the notification said is, here's what's in here, and you have to make your own decision, customer, as to what you would like to do. That led to town hall meetings. You can imagine how those went. And that also led to a couple of lawsuits filed against Middlesex Water, one in Superior Court of New Jersey. That is a class action that we're actually trying to have removed to federal court for numerous legal reasons. And there's also a similar federal suit against us. Meanwhile, with respect to our remediation, it continues to go forward. We did take, and we're able to take our Park Avenue facility offline while we completed our remediation. And so our levels have come back down, basically, and not exceeding the threshold at this point. And at the same time, what we're instituting at Park Avenue is what's called granular activated carbon filtration, which is kind of like what it implies. We are getting carbon filters, and it's going to filter out the PFOA. Now, here's another issue. we're putting forward granulated activated carbon, but we're also leaving space at the facility that if we ever have to use another technology to destroy the PFOA, we're able to go back and do that. Part of why we're proceeding with granulated activated carbon is cost. The cost is approximately $50 to $53 million. It may tick up a little bit due to inflation. More advanced technologies, most prominently what's called reverse osmosis, we're talking hundreds of millions of dollars. And this is where what the EPA has done over the past summer comes in. So the EPA has come in with a new health advisory. And their health advisory on PFOA is 4 parts per quadrillion. That is undetectable. That means that for every water system, granulated activated carbon is not going to be enough should that ever become regulation. And so you're now coming into an era where we may have regulation, and we have to act as water purveyors, whether we are an investor-owned utility, whether we are a public system, and we have to get the PFOA out, and that will come, obviously, at a cost. So my cautionary tale to the state commissioners, and I won't make you all stand up again, is, commissioners, this is coming to your doorstep. It's coming to our doorstep, and it's coming to the advocate's doorstep. And with that, that leads right into Steve with the rate making.
Steve, are you scared? That's my first question. Does it, Jay has a little drama. Has set the room a little drama. So I guess, what are your concerns based off of what Jay is saying? We're having done this for, these are your words, I think, 45 years, been in this sector. What's your initial reaction to that setup?
Well, let me, full disclosure, I am one of those customers that was getting water from that well field and got those notices. And as soon as I got those notices, I called Jay and said, "What's up?"
Well, he didn't phrase it like that, but.
The word "what" was there.
Yeah.
So I guess there are a couple of things. And when in rate school and through other panels, Jay and I have done this panel. We did it at the winter meetings earlier in the year, in February in DC. But one of the things that we have to keep remembering, and in everyone, whether you're a regulator or you've been involved in this for any number of years, one of the things that I think is important to keep track of is that in our world, we tend to get very granular. We tend to look at not the forest, not the trees, not the branches, but the leaves and pieces of the leaves. And I think every once in a while, it's a good idea to take a step back and say, okay, let's look at the big picture. We all have to deal with that pesky thing called the Constitution. And so as part of that, the utilities generally are perfectly willing to do what they can to comply with whatever government wants them to do. But the other part of that is that they have to get paid for it. They have to get reimbursed for it, and they have to earn a reasonable return on it. And that's where the rubber hits the road. So rate making involves those stages, but we can't forget that they're willing to do, the companies are willing to do what you want. The municipals are in a slightly different situation because, with one exception, I think, there's only one thing that municipal public officials like doing less than telling people that they have to pay higher rates or higher taxes, and that is investing money in something that goes in the ground that you can't see. They hate it. The exception, I think, is that regulators hate it, and this takes off on Jay's comments about granulated activated carbon or reverse osmosis, is that, okay, because of all the stuff that's going on, most systems are opting initially for granulated activated carbon. It's just as effective initially to meet the initial stages, and it's cheaper, but virtually all the engineers that I've talked to, in fact, all the engineers that I've talked to, have said in order to meet those standards, the new health advisories that EPA has promulgated, that that everyone is going to have to go to reverse osmosis at some point. And so what the regulators want to know, and I'll speak for the regulators, jump up and yell at me if I'm wrong. The one thing the regulators hate is saying, okay, in Jay's case, we have to spend $50 or $55 million for this granulated activated carbon facility. Don't tell me in 3 or 5 years that you have to tear that down in order to put up a reverse osmosis plant. They want to make sure that whatever you do, it can be used for the next phase, because it'll make them nuts. I don't see any regulators jumping up and yelling at me, so I suspect that's probably right. But that's what's going to happen, and that's where the rubber is going to hit the road for the commissions. And we have to remember that commissions were created, depending on the state, more than 100 years ago, because the legislature didn't want to do this. Because no matter what you do or don't do, it's a bad answer. Either the utilities are going to go nuts, the public is going to go nuts, everybody's going to go nuts. Doesn't matter what your decision is. No one's going to be happy. And the legislatures didn't want to make that decision because they didn't want everybody mad at them. So they set up the commissions to do that. And we have to remember that these are not easy decisions, but they are decisions which, as both Karen and Jay said, Lauren and Jay said, they're coming. And one way or the other, as we all have done, who have done utility work for a while know, on whatever side you're on, if you want something done, somebody is going to have to pay for it. Now, you get to decide who gets to pay for it in what amounts, but you can't avoid the problem that somebody is going to pay for it. And that's going to be the problem. So we can talk about, and we will later on, regulatory ways of doing that, rate ways of doing it, and there are ways. But it's going to be painful, and nobody's going to be happy.
I don't know how much we're paying Steve to be here, but I've never had a better setup for the questions I have for Karen now. So Karen, I think Steve has set it up to where it's pretty obvious customers aren't going to be excited for it. I rarely see customers excited, but between the concern for their health, obvious, if they get a letter like they did, we're required to, like the letter that Steve got, if they get a letter like that, they're not going to be happy. Again, I've yet to see a consumer happy about a proposed rate increase, whether it's related to the capital necessary to make their water drinkable or for some other reason. So can you talk to us a little bit about the consumer impact, the concern around cost, for one, but also that outreach and that education, so that the first time they're hearing about it is not a letter that was drafted by DEP attorneys?
Okay, I want to say first, I agree with Chris from the last panel that we're operating from a hole to begin with, that we have to get ourselves out of. And part of it's because, as he stated, there's a lack of trust in not government entities, but private organizations too. And that's difficult because we're going to have to, when we do outreach, we're going to have to build that trust. But another thing that concerns me too is when we do outreach, we have our own language. It's like a foreign language to the general public. And TDEC, that's the state agency in Tennessee, TDEC's technical people have their own language. Commissions have their own language. And attorneys have their own language. And it's different from the general public. So we have that we need to deal with because, if entities are doing outreach separately, so TDEC is doing it differently doing it separately from the utility, consumers may hear something that they think contradicts those two entities, when in reality it's just the terminology that's being used. And when you have that contradiction, then you're not really building that trust, because they're thinking, well, here's two entities, they're supposed to be, handling this problem, and they can't even agree. And another issue that I am concerned about is just fatigue from the general public. We had Flint, and Flint also caused other states to look at their lead pipes, and I don't know how many articles I read from, across the United States where, lead in schools, that was a real focus. In fact, they passed some legislation in Tennessee to make sure that that testing was happening in the schools and that the parents were being notified and that the schools were handling it. And so I think that fatigue from Flint, from COVID, the emergency orders, and now we're having, extreme weather events, the public's just tired of hearing of all these things that's out of their control. And it's all overwhelming because all of that information on all those events can just be difficult to understand. And so we have to know that when we go in to now talk about PFAS or PFOA. Besides the fact it's complicated, just the term is complicated. So we use the acronym. So I look at the who, what, where, when. The who, I don't think it needs to be just the State Environmental Agency or EPA and the utility talking to consumers. I think everybody who's going to play a role needs to go out and talk to consumers. Better if you can have multiple entities talking at the same event so that they see that, oh, they're all together, they know what they're talking about, and so they're all on the same page. And also that they can clarify any confusion that someone might say, and they say, that sounds conflicting, what's going on here? And that can be explained at that time. So I think the commission needs to be out there doing consumer advocate work, explaining what is our role. What is it going to mean when the utilities are having to deal with this? And this is our role. And the consumer advocates explaining our role is this. Because I think a lot of consumers may not even know that there's a utility commission, much less a consumer advocate, because in Tennessee, we just generally don't make the news. Other states do, but not in Tennessee. And so I think it's important that all the players are involved in talking from the same page. That may take a lot of coordination, but I think it would be worth it. So that's the who. When? The sooner the better. Before they start hearing from the news that their drinking water is contaminated because the news found out from testing results. And so that's how they first hear about it. I think that would be the worst case scenario because they haven't even heard from their utility or the government that there's a problem in my drinking water. So the sooner the better. So that's when. So what? So what do we need to do? Well, I think you need to first start explaining what PFAS and PFOA, what is it? And then, explain that there's health advisories now, but we expect that, but they're not enforceable. That's going to be confusing to them. And then we're going to have limits. EPA is going to be passing rules to have enforceable limits. And what does that mean? And what does that mean the utility is going to be doing to make sure they make those limits? And then there's and all that leads to they're going to have to build some additional treatment at their plant that costs money. How is that handled? So like I said, it needs to be a team effort because there's just so many entities involved that can be very confusing to the general public. So who, what, where? I think we need to build. I've been to public hearings. Some are well attended. I had one in a high school gym when I was at TDEC because that was the biggest. It was a rural community. That was the biggest meeting event. And I'm telling you, the bleachers were full and people were standing because they wanted to be heard. But I've been in the city and no one shows up. So it's like, okay, what did we do differently? And I think part of it is that we might need to think about developing relationships with new organizations that we haven't in the past, especially for groups that might not ordinarily get a lot of attention because they may be in low income areas. So you might not get the participation that you would like, or minority neighborhoods who feel disenfranchised. So you really want to reach those groups. So you need to think about, well, our notice in the newspaper doesn't really work. Notice on a website doesn't really work too, because especially the disenfranchised, low income, they may not have Wi-Fi or connection at their home. And even if it's available, it might be too expensive for them. You know, and we all talk about everyone has a phone. Well, I can tell you right now, if I'm reading something for content, I'm not reading it off my phone. That's just too small. And so when I'm at home, I print it off my computer, or I go to my computer at home and pull it up, you know, then you can read it. Can't really read it on the phone. So you can't expect that if you're going to send dense information to the consumers and they can read it on the phone, then they're going to understand. I know with whoever is receiving bills still, bill inserts, people often chunk those. They don't even read them because all they want to know is what they have to pay that month. And so we really need to think about, okay, we need to start talking about this. They really need to understand now what we know now. What's our plan moving forward? And how does that process work? Who's all involved? I think we need to make a lot of extra effort to meet those communities where they need us to meet them, whether it be in the local gym, high school gym, because that's the biggest meeting area. I know in Nashville, when they built the new police stations, they have huge community rooms that they offer out to free. You might need to go to churches, because maybe that church in that area is really the meeting place for that community. And so I think about all of this, and it's a lot of work, but I think if we really want to build the trust back and get the information out so that people don't feel like no one's looking at it, no one's protecting me, no one's looking out for me and my family, I think we're going to have to make that effort.
So Dr. Weinrich, Jay was talking about how they've left room in their facility just in case there's another treatment necessary. And Steve was certainly talking about, the expectation or the concern that maybe what we have today may not necessarily be what we need, depending on those expected, the levels. So can you talk for a minute about the treatments today, the treatments for the contaminants that we can detect today versus in the future, and what that distinction may be and what we need to be looking at?
Absolutely. And I was wondering if I could make a couple comments, Karen, from your points. So before we get to the fun stuff with treatment, I think this public education point is so critical, so the when now, and that's, we were at the annual conference for AWWA in June. And one of the takeaways, when we're communicating with customers is to consider the phrase, if I hear from you first, I trust you first. If I hear from you last, I trust you last. And that was really a powerful comment and kind of guiding principle on how we can approach this complex challenge with PFAS that we're facing, already dealing with. But to all of the points that you brought up, Karen, I think the point is right now utilities are taking the lead on that. Who's going to do it? Yes, all of these things are needed. We need to communicate with our customers. We need to meet them where they're at in terms of education. And excellent point about, how to go about that. American Water is a principal investigator for a Water Research Foundation project called Risk Communication for Water Sector Professionals, doing exactly this. putting together the communication materials that all utilities need to be able to meet their customers where they're at as the regulations are changing, as we're learning more about public health impacts, as we're learning more about occurrence. And we, as part of that project, which started last September, we're just wrapping it up now. It's taken the majority of my time in addition to all things PFAS, but it's so critical that we focus on how to communicate to the customers. And we did a survey to understand what are their concerns. Number one, we asked them, how concerned are you with contamination in your drinking water? Not surprisingly, 75% said concerned or very concerned. Then we asked them, have you heard about PFAS or PFOA? And the response there was less than 10%. Maybe around 3% had some understanding or had some understanding for PFAS. So there is a huge disconnect. People are definitely concerned about contamination. You hear contamination. Yes, I don't want that in my drinking water. But then there's still a big gap to educate around PFAS and where exposures are. So one of the other questions that we asked in that in preparation for developing these communication materials is, what are the biggest topics that are of concern to you? And the top three was the impact to my health, how can I reduce my exposure, and what's my utility doing? And those three are really guiding these materials that we're developing that include onserts, but also include recommendations to, letter writing to our commissions, to our public, to our regulators, because we are all learning at the same time, but we want the customer to be empowered and have the information that they need through various aspects. So, across American Water's website, we have all of a simple one-pager to start with at this point. Those communication materials that we're finalizing will be out for the entire water utility sector to leverage, because we want to speak with the same language, we want to speak with the same messaging, and stand there together as, a community on the side and with our customers, because we are in those communities too, right? So I just wanted to mention that this communication piece, and again, as a scientist, getting into the legal and communication aspect, it wasn't necessarily something that I ever thought would happen, but it is so critical at this point to be all-encompassing when it comes to contamination, developing the technology, and what we're doing. So thanks for letting me respond to that. But so in terms of technology, Jay mentioned granular activated carbon. So that's currently a best practice. That's the most inexpensive of the types of treatment we have right now. We also have ion exchange. So for utilities that can build larger space to implement treatment down the line, that is not the case for a lot of locations. So we actually have a site in New Jersey where we had to choose ion exchange because it has a smaller footprint. Now it's more expensive, but there's a floodplain. You can't build out on that floodplain, and we had to implement treatment. So what do? That's where you're limited in either footprint or technology, et cetera. So reverse osmosis is a whole other issue that's frankly not something that you can do inland, or it's generating a waste. So also underscoring the topic of this panel, which is what do we do with the waste? Number one, we can absorb it using carbon. We can take that carbon and change it out, and that happens over time. It's not going to remove all of the PFAS compounds that are out there. It does a pretty good job for what we call the long chain compounds, so PFOA, PFOS, PFNA. Those are the three that are regulated in New Jersey. But when we start looking at these short chain and replacement compounds that, since PFOA and PFOS were phased out, there are the replacement compounds that are used in industry and manufacturing. Those are not well removed by our current technologies. And we're still learning what the public health impacts and occurrence are for them. But the challenge is, and Steve, to your point, yes, this is going to be an evolving issue as we gather more information on the science side related to public health, related to what the lifetime health advisories are, if other PFAS compounds are regulated. Right now, the best available technologies are GAC and ion exchange. There's other technologies that are being developed, but they're not necessarily ready for prime time. And we need research, we need additional research and investment in that to deal with this problem that's, again, not just a water utility problem, but an environmental issue and a public health issue. And investing in that research and technology to break these compounds down so that we can take them out and remove them from the water supplies as well. So I think that was part of the
Thanks, I'm
question.
still scared. So you are doing a good job at that. My goodness. So Steve, we talked about the treatment a little bit. Once you figure out you've got a problem that needs to be fixed, and we've got a couple of identified ways to treat it, what are some of the considerations that need to be made when we figure out how to pay for that treatment, how customers are asked to recover the cost of that treatment?
Well, there are a number of traditional rate-making treatments that you can use to deal with the various issues. When I first started in this business a couple of years in, late 70s, we had a problem in New Jersey because we were right next to Pennsylvania called 3 Mile Island. And if you think the town hall meetings that Jay had and all that about the notices from DEP about PFAS and PFOA were bad, you should have been where I was 45 years ago about 3 Mile Island hearings, because people were not happy. They were scared, they were hysterical, and I agree with all the public education talk and all, absolutely true, but looking back 40 years ago, I think the only thing that calmed the 3 Mile Island fears was the fact that we went through 3 or 4 years and things calmed down. I'm not sure public health, I'm not sure the public education processes that we all went through at the time, I think they were helpful, but I'm not sure they were the things that got everybody over that. But there are traditional rate-making techniques that you can use. In the nuclear plant debates in the late 70s, early 80s, those plants tended to take 10 to 15 to 20 years to build, and so there were mechanisms developed at the time, allowance for funds used during construction work in progress, which were methods of basically spreading out the costs and allocating the risk slightly differently than historically they were using. I'm not quite sure that those specific methods will be usable for this, because the plants, I don't think, will take that long to build, and at least until recently, interest rates weren't quite as high as they were in the late 70s and early 80s before they calmed down. So there are traditional rate-making techniques to be used. It seems to me that one of the things that I've seen over the last 40 years is that the concept that commissions used to use in terms of gradualism, in terms of rate steps, both before a plan is constructed and after, I think we're going to have to look at those again, because I think as in many things in our society, perceptions have gotten much more rigid over the last number of years. And they don't want to think, no one wants to think about things that were actually useful over a long period of time that they just don't want to think about. So, for example, many states hold to the view that, for obvious reasons, that, okay, we don't want to have customers paying for something until it's done, until it's providing service. If you have a 5-mile pipeline to build, it doesn't matter if you've built 4.5 miles if you can't get that other half mile done, because no water can go through it. The same thing is true with sewer. The same thing is true with all sorts of stuff. Transmission lines. Until that last piece is done, it's not done. It's not providing service. I think we may have to change that perspective, because I think what's going to happen is that if you wait, you're going to get these huge spikes in rates, and that makes customers nuts. They're willing to deal with 2 or 3 or 4 or 5% increases year to year. What they don't want to see is 20 or 30%. And unless you start dealing with gradualism through stepping up of rates, you're not going to be able to deal with these pressures in a rational way. And I think it's going to change. It's going to require a change in how we think about it. I don't know if that answered your question, but
It does partially, but going to what Jay said for a second, leaving that space for something that may come later, do you have concerns around, and if you do, how can it be fixed? Either of you, concerns around, I'll create a scenario here, right? In 7 years, you all of a sudden figure out you need to, activated carbon isn't going to do it, whatever the EPA comes out with, and you need to do reverse osmosis, for instance. Have you all thought about deferral accounting, accelerated depreciation, to ensure that you're not paying for the new system and the old system at the same time, and the old system is out back scrapped up?
Before we get to those rate-making concepts, I think there are 2 shorter-term steps that, from the utility perspective, has to come first. And it goes to the public trust that has been mentioned here. But here's what I've learned are the first 2 things that you should do if you find PFOA in your water system. And this is from the lawyer. 1, find the polluter. 2, when you find the polluter, sue the polluter. And Middlesex Water has been on the record with this in its litigation against 3M. What we will obtain from the 3M case, whether it is a settlement, whether it is fully litigated, will go to the benefit of the ratepayer. And that would be the first line of payment in terms of those systems. And a lot of, without getting into the suit itself, because we're still in mid-litigation, let's just say that my company has put a lot of thought into the fact that what we're going to have to do because of the pollution may wind up in the world of reverse osmosis versus the world of granular activated carbon. So yes, litigation for a lot of systems, whether you're municipal, whether you're investor-owned utility, could take a very long time. I feel we're at least fortunate that we're not in the multi-district litigation panel. It still will take a long time from our perspective as well. But if you're going to be credible, and if you're going to try and at least mitigate some of these issues on the rate-making side that will take time to unwind, the first thing you do is go after those who are responsible for it, and they should be the ones who are held accountable for it, first and foremost.
let me just supplement that a little bit. Directly to answer your question, have the companies thought about what do you do about the current processes and how do you pay for both current and future? The answer is yes. If the company is responsible, they have thought about all that, and they will be thinking about that, and they will be engaging the commission and the public advocates and all that to deal with that problem. And any commission, any regulator, any utility that says, oh, well, we don't want to be paying both for current and future and all that other stuff is lying to you. They have to be. And the fact that it's hard, sorry, we all have to be adults at some point, and the fact that it's hard doesn't solve that problem. It doesn't help you to say, it's hard, I don't want to deal with it. There's no ostrich. You can't stick your head in the sand and pretend that nothing's happening. It is happening. And at some point, we have to, as part of the public education campaign, say to the public, we know this is hard, we know this is not fun, we're not happy about it, but this is the reality. Is that a more direct answer to your question?
Yeah, I always appreciate direct answers. It always makes questioning on the stand go a little faster too, and the same goes for panels. So I guess on that, Steve, if we could just transition just for a quick second. What's different? The contaminants is a wide term, right? And the basis of the panel is contaminants. We've certainly spent a lot of time on PFAS, but the last thing we felt like we dealt with, many are still dealing with, is this issue and this concern around lead. And I think that certainly probably drives some of those responses in the poll or the data that Dr. Weinrich was talking about, is this concern around water. It's certainly what folks have heard about that has happened in other communities. So how is this different than the lead situation from your experience and your perspective?
I'm not sure it is all that different. Part of the problem is, and both Karen and Lauren have talked about it, is getting the public to understand that there are different levels of concern. There's today's crisis and there's long-term crisis. The DEP in New Jersey, when they identified their level of 14 parts per trillion, and did that 2 years ago, or last year immediately, from what I've been able to tell, and I've looked, is that they claim, and no one's, or at least I have not seen the data, although I've looked for it, they claim that the basis of that 14 is scientifically based. Everybody says something is scientifically based. Okay, fine. What does that mean? And in their instance, what they say is, if you drink 8 glasses of water, 8-ounce glasses of water every day for 70 years, 70 years, your chance at the end of that 70 years, because of PFAS, or one of the PFAS compounds, will increase by 1 in a million chances. 1 in a million. Lead, which about a year ago everyone started noticing because of Flint and anywhere where there's old housing stock that has lead service lines, lead, even though the national standard is 15, the science behind it, and EPA acknowledges this, the health-related standard for lead is 0. You can't, any lead is bad, and they'll be right up front, but the standard is 15. The other problem with lead is that lead, according to the engineers, you can get rid of roughly 70% of the lead problem in any given community, house, whatever, is by eliminating the lead in the service line, which is the connection between the street and the house. There's still another 30%, and that's in the house. And no one is suggesting socializing those costs. And so when the public says, wait a minute, you want me to pay for what? And it's going to get rid of 70%? Well, that's not solving my problem if I've still got, fixtures in the house and lead solder and lead pipes. So the public doesn't want to hear that, and I understand that. But that's the reality, and the public doesn't want to hear that you're going to spend all this money and only deal with 70% of my problem. They don't want to deal with it. I get it, I understand it, but if you want to deal with the problem, you got to be an adult, and we have to either face up and say, yes, we're going to deal with it, or no, we're not. And there are reasons for it, but sometimes it's not easy to be an adult. I hate to tell you this, but it's true.
So, and I this is just a joke, Jay, so I'm just going to avert my eyes for a second. But not all of us have Middlesex money, Karen. There's so many, and Kentucky and Tennessee are this way, right? So many of our water systems in America are not privately owned, right? There is not private capital available to make investment for the public convenience and necessity. And they're depending on public sources of financing because none of them recover depreciation, or very few of them even recover fully fund depreciation. So from your perspective, you all, let me just ask from your experience between private and public water, what's going to be the difference on that front when it comes to addressing this issue of PFAS? And that's a little bit for Jay, and then go down to Karen after that.
Well, in terms of the legislation that passed Congress this year, certainly a lot of that was tilted toward public systems, municipal systems. And to give a shout out in fairness to Rob Powelson, who I know is here with the National Association of Water Companies, certainly the investor-owned utilities all believe that, there should be aid across the board. PFOA doesn't respect public versus private, and I know Rob and his team have been on the front lines in Congress on that. PFOA is not going to respect whether you're a public or a private system, and there are public systems out there who have managed their systems in the pre-PFOA era well, and there are others who have not and who have been resistant to passing necessary costs along to their taxpayers. And this is going to be one more notch or one more exacerbation in that issue between that. But to the sense that, you know, people are not going to be untouched financially from PFOA, I think we have to kind of get rid of that notion. And for a lot of public systems, it's only going to exacerbate what some public systems have been resistant to do out there.
Karen, perspective on that?
Yep, when I hear about, well, all this money is available out there, it's not enough for everything, but there's, you know, more money available now than before. I again think about the small systems that are in Tennessee. A lot of them are rural. They have, you know, bare bones staff. They have a bookkeeper, not really an accountant. They have maybe the office worker, the secretary answering phones and such, but they don't have a grant writer or a writer for the SRF fund. And I know in talking to TDEC's SRF program people before, you know, they tried to streamline and make the form simpler for the SRF funds. That still didn't get those small systems. And the reason they don't have those small systems is because if they had a workshop in Nashville, well, those small systems are not going to send someone there because that means they're not there doing their work and they really don't have a deep bench. So they're not going to send someone to Nashville for that. And even if you had it electronically, it's still unlikely that you're going to have someone be able to take a few hours out of their day from their regular duties because, again, there's no real backup there to do that. So, I mean, I know that one SRF manager, she's no longer there, she talked about, you know, I told him I'd come out there and help him fill out the form. But they still had to gather information. And so when I think about these systems, these are the systems that don't come in for rate cases very often because they don't have the staff or personnel to really put a rate case together, and they don't have the money to pay a consultant to come do that work for them. So they often are staff-assisted rate cases. So TPUC staff really put it all together and help them gather their information and then present it to the commission. Well, I think you're going to need to do that if you're really trying to get them some of those new monies that are out there. It's going to have to be almost like staff-assisted because the staff are the ones that really have all their financials, especially if they've recently done a rate case. And then you're going to have to coordinate with the TDEC staff for the SRF fund or wherever your SRF fund is located in your state and have them part of that for that form. And that's a lot of resources for a lot of commissions who are also short-staffed.
Well, and that's just the money. That's
Yes.
not the technical support
Yes,
for
the engineering.
explaining to these folks what granulated, what.
Activated carbon.
Yeah, see, I
Yeah.
get ready for this, and I still, it's not simple stuff.
Yes.
Right? And these are, again, folks that, yeah.
Yeah, and the SRF fund, you know, they have engineers that review everything, but they're not the engineers that are advising the utility. All they're saying is what the utility is proposing, the plans that we've looked at, that's sufficient and we can approve them, but they're not the ones saying you need to change this. They just say this isn't sufficient, and so you need to go back to your engineer and come back with some revised plans.
Let me just throw in one thing. When Karen talks about SRF, that's state revolving funds. Some people may be aware of that, some may not. But the problem with a lot of the state revolving funds, and many states have them, not all, is that they often come with these funds comes a curse. And so very often what the small systems in particular have found is that it's simply not worth it for them to apply for state revolving funds because, for example, in a number of states, any use of state revolving funds involves paying prevailing wage, which means union wage, and these small systems, whether they are public or whether they are private, they find that even though there's a lower interest rate with state revolving funds, it is more than offset by paying the higher wages to the union wages, so they therefore don't apply for those funds. So even if they're available, they're not worth it. And so there are all sorts of countervailing policies that states have set up for perfectly good public policy reasons that undercut the other things that you want to do.
So before we open it up to the crowd for questions, I do have one question. Nobody may be willing to take it, so that's fine. Any thoughts on whether or not that this issue and the treatment necessary for this PFAS issue might lead to greater consolidation of smaller water utilities?
If no one else wants to jump in, I guess I will. It seems to me that on its surface, the obvious answer to Karen's problem with the multitude of tiny little water systems, none of whom have the ability to fund or the expertise to do the improvements that are needed, the obvious answer is, well, you have to either privatize, regionalize, do something in order to deal with the funds and the expertise necessary to do that. How you get from point A to point B is a very difficult problem and we can't answer it in the next 10 minutes, let alone in a week.
And to just add one footnote to Steve's, to the extent you go down that road, it is only workable if the regulatory compact stays intact. The regulatory compact being that if a utility does make the prudent investments in the system, that they get a fair opportunity on the return. Whenever the regulatory compact goes out of balance, and unfortunately I've been in this industry long enough now that I've seen this happen, when it is out of balance, bad things can happen.
So point of privilege here. I want to have to disagree that there's a regulatory compact in the sense that I don't know. Anyways, there's certainly to Steve's the Constitution. The Constitution's for real. It exists, folks. So that we agree there certainly. Karen, one last thing.
Yeah, I would say that in Tennessee, we've talked about regionalization of water systems, and it just doesn't happen because those small communities, that's their water. And they don't want another community having any say whatsoever with their water. And so they jealously guard that entity.
So I think I'm about to be pulled off stage, but before I do, I just want to thank the University of Missouri twice for two different things. One is these are the most comfortable chairs I've ever been involved with in a panel. And second, I want to thank the folks at the university for putting together such a panelist, for the great panelists here, and ask that you all join me in thanking them today.